Hey everybody, what's going on? Hellmite here, bringing another video from Grab the Lantern today. Today I wanted to finally give my year-end review of all of the champions that were released in 2023. This is going to include not only all of the new champions that were released, as well as champions that were VGU, that received the full VGU, so I'm not going to be touching on ASUs or anyone who just got a visual update, specifically anyone who got a VGU. Spoiler alert, there was one champion. Technically it's kind of more of a half VGU, but this is Jax we're talking about, of course, but we'll get to that. And give my thoughts on generally how well Riot did with the champion releases this year. This will not only touch on them as far as mechanics go, but also their thematic potential, as well as their balance, as I feel like all three are sort of important for getting a sense for how well the champions did this year and what we can be looking forward to for the coming years. 2023 only had 4 new champions and half a VGU. Again, that's a little disappointing. That's even one fewer champion than we got last year, which is already pretty disappointing. But we'll see as Riot starts to kind of pick things back up, and we'll see if they decide 4 is a good number or if they want to do more or less than that. I hope it's not less, but it very well could be, and how many more VGUs we get in the coming years. But with all that said, let's go ahead and rewind all the way to the beginning of 2023 and talk about our first new champion, Milio, the Gentle Flame. Mechanically, Milio does attempt to do some unique things, but he ends up feeling like a very bog-standard enchanter support despite it all. This isn't to say that he doesn't have some unique outputs. His W range extension and his R's mass cleanse are both mechanics that only he has access to and that sort of define him as a champion, but most of the time, Milio feels like any other enchanter support. He's focused on healing, shielding, and generally buffing up his friends, and even though he does have some unique outputs, I think they're a little hard to appreciate or notice. I think the range extension can be very noticeable in certain circumstances, but not every champion can really benefit from it. Let's say you're a melee champion, for example, it almost literally does nothing for you. Certain other champions in the bot lane don't really care about auto attack range extension, they care more about their abilities, and as a result they don't really care about the range. And sometimes the extra range just doesn't really come up, for example. Like, oh, I pressed W and my AD carry walked at them and they walked away, and so we didn't get to use the bonus range. It's tough for me to find examples of where the range extension really shines and where it's really powerful. Conversely, the R cleanse is very powerful, but as I mentioned even in the Milio review video, cleansing CC is just an underrated mechanic by many players. There's a reason most people in casual games don't take cleanse as a summoner spell, because it's just hard to appreciate, and cleanse is mostly there as a way to stop things from happening, which means that even if it was a good cleanse, let's say, you know, a Morgana binding lands on your AD carry, you cleanse it, everyone walks away, well, a team fight that might have happened didn't happen because there was a cleanse and therefore nothing happened, right? But I think Milio still ends up having some fun things that he can do. Fired Up was a very fun ability when Milio first came out. I still really like playing with it, but it was sort of a necessary casualty of Milio's kit when pros began abusing it, which forced him more into that traditional enchanter niche. I do think that R being used as a sort of team-wide heal is quite strong, and I do think Ultra Mega Fire Kick is a fun, peeling ability that can feel very similar to things like Janonado, with additional sort of fun by kicking minions, for example, through the wave to crash onto an enemy champion. There are some fun things that Milio does, but ultimately it feels like a lot of other enchanter supports. You're going to heal, you're going to shield, you're going to buff, and you're not going to do a whole lot besides that, so why play Milio instead of someone like Soraka or Lulu or Janna? Balance-wise, Milio as well has been generally unobjectionable. He had a brief stint of being strong in pro play, mostly because of Fired Up, honestly, but additionally because he has a cleanse, and the pros are very adept at taking advantage of cleanse mechanics. But once Fired Up got tapped down, Milio dropped out of pro play almost entirely. I think he saw play a couple of times during Worlds this year, but otherwise the champion just was not very present in professional play, which isn't necessarily a bad thing in my mind, though the ongoing tank support metagame did have something to do with that. In casual play, meanwhile, Milio has barely made waves. I have a friend who plays a lot of Milio, but I guess he's a rare sight for most players. I feel like most players don't really care about Milio from a thematic perspective, or for what he does uniquely, because, as mentioned before, cleanses and range extensions are hard to be interested or exciting in comparison to someone like Soraka's map-wide heals, or Janna's ability to reset teamfights with Monsoon, right? Like, those are things that are more easily you can get excited about more, right? It's hard to get excited about what Milio specifically does, and as a result, most players just haven't sort of gravitated towards him. Character-wise, meanwhile, Milio follows the trend of many champions released recently, which is that he doesn't add to our understanding of the world or push any plot points forward. He's just kind of around. There are some unique things that he does. He introduces the fact that the fire axiom can be used for healing instead of hurting, and as presence is potentially a big deal in Qiyana's ongoing character arc, I believe she's expressed interest in Milio showing up in the Ishtal capital city. There's maybe the chance that Milio becomes a power player in Ishtal politics, but all that's sort of hinted at, and Milio himself doesn't seem to have much of a goal besides go to Ishao Khan and get, like, tutored or whatever. Which means that as a character, it's hard to say, like, okay, what's he gonna do next? We don't really care. And Riot's been doing this more often, and while I can understand and respect the desire that they have to do this, which is adding characters that players from different regions of the real world can relate to, I wish they do a better job of, like, actually doing something with those characters. I really feel like Milio is just going to get forgotten about, and they won't do anything with him for years. So ultimately, Milio is just kind of fine from almost all angles. He's unobjectionable in basically every regard, balance, mechanics, thematics, but like, that doesn't necessarily make him a good champion. He just sort of exists in this weird middle ground where you can easily forget he exists, but like, if you do play him or like read his lore or whatever, you're like, yeah, okay, that's fine. And as a result, I almost wonder if that's like even good, right? I'd much rather hate a champion or love a champion than feel like a champion's just sort of there, and that's where Milio ends up for me. Next up, let's go ahead and talk about the second champion released this year, everyone's favorite, Bark and Darken, Naafiri. Now, Naafiri, from a mechanical perspective, scared me originally. Riot were saying that they wanted her to be a low skill floor assassin, which is not how assassins should be designed. Assassins are supposed to be high skill floor, high skill ceiling, basically meaning that you need to be very good to execute, because fundamentally assassins have a non-fun play pattern where they kill you with ease and don't give you a chance to fight back, and that's not fun to play against. So they say, Riot says you have to be really good at this champion in order to actually do that. But I think they've managed to design Naafiri well enough such that the concept makes sense and in fact makes her quite fun to play. And I think the way in which they've designed Naafiri is very good too. They found a way to make it so that Naafiri sort of forces you to play in an assassin's mindset, even though she's really simple and you might try to not play her like that, right? Like W being body blockable, for example. Even though it's targeted, very, very powerful, it can still be body blocked, which means that Naafiri can't, like, full-on front-to-back team fight without finding a flank, because otherwise her W to the backline will get intercepted, so it forces you to find flanks. Naafiri's ultimate having a big reveal on it means that you want to be walking into Fog of War and pressing R and seeing if you can catch champions in rotation and burst them down on their own, plus you get the movement speed to run away with. Like, there are some things that Naafiri does that sort of handholds you into playing her like an assassin, which I think is very good, despite her being a relatively easy to execute on champion overall. And the rest of her kit, I think, has enough depth that while Naafiri is easy to just press buttons on, she really rewards players who understand her mechanics at a deep level and who can execute on her play patterns in high-stress situations. Landing double Q, for example. If you don't land both halves of your Q, you're missing a huge chunk of your damage. If you're able to optimize your E such that you get both the dash and the explosion at the end, you get a bunch more damage. If you know that fighting with lots of dogs is better than fighting with no dogs, that's another point of mastery, right? And comparatively as well, then keeping your dogs alive in lane is important. Good Naafiri players will realize this. Not so good Naafiri players will not do very good at that, and then will realize, why am I doing no damage, right? And it's because they're not keeping their passive around. The only real concern I had with Naafiri's design is how her packmates incentivize more of a bruisery playstyle and build. It's something that came up shortly after her release, where she was seeing a lot of play top lane, and it's something that could very easily rear its head again in the coming months. And I think that her packmates are just kind of fine. I wish they would have designed her to be more about minion mancing, but I do think that the current execution is overall okay. I think the pets matter, but they're also deal-withable, but they also don't matter so much that, like, you don't just want to press buttons on Naafiri. Overall, I think she's in a fine spot, I think, design-wise. I think they did a very good job, and even if she's been a little bit too on the maybe not, there are a couple of rough edges, I think generally Riot did an okay job with her mechanically. Balance-wise, Naafiri hasn't really made waves. That said, she also hasn't been pro-play viable ever since she came out, because they were in the middle of playoffs when she released. So, as a result, I really get the sense that we may see a lot more Naafiri in 2024 when she finally is in the hands of professional players. She's been nerfed a couple of times throughout the time she's been around, but very light taps. I think Riot have generally been happy with her performance, and when I've seen her, she's been fine, not overbearing, but definitely a solid champion if you know what you're doing, but certainly the kind of champion where if you fall behind, same with any assassin, you just sort of stop being a champion overall. I think she still may end up being a frustrating champion to play against because of her targeted W, but that's like basically all assassins. I think she feels fine to me. From a character perspective, though, Naafiri's in a very odd spot. I really feel like Riot started making a dog pack champion a while back, and then halfway through said, what if it was a Darkin? And just sort of shoehorned the Darkin element into Naafiri's backstory, even though you can't really do that. And as a result, Naafiri's backstory feels really sort of shoehorned. The initial telling of her story had her dagger torn to pieces by Shireen and Hounds, which is a physical impossibility, because if the aspects of Targon couldn't do that, how could a pack of mangy dogs do it, right? They since retconned that story to make it less clear exactly what happened to the dagger, but we still have so many questions about what this means for Naafiri. Like, how is she able to control all the pack at the same time? Is she controlling all the pack at the same time? Is she, like, spawning new dogs out of her body? Or are they just, like, finding new dogs in the waste and saying, you're a part of the pack now? Like, how does all this work? It doesn't feel much like Riot actually have an explanation for this, as much as they just said, we're never going to discuss it. We're never going to give you guys an actual reason for how all this works. Just shut up and take your Darkin Champion. Which is not really what I want out of Darkin Champions. I think that when Riot really takes their time and decides to tell a story with the character and decides exactly how the character works, they can end up with some really cool concepts. And I was excited when they initially said, yeah, Naafiri is a pack of dogs, not just one. That was like, oh, well, how did that happen? How does this work, right? What kind of Darkin magic is going on? And the answer is Riot literally have no idea either. Now, I could be wrong. They could actually know. My gut says they don't, because the story had the dagger torn to pieces, and I would assume, therefore, that they just didn't think of the consequences or know their own lore when they actually wrote that. So as a result, we end up with a character that just feels very loose from a story perspective. That Riot said, let's just make it a Darkin. People like Darkin, right? And they didn't actually try to make her a Darkin from the ground up. Her goal of forming a Darkin army is also pretty loose. Like, what steps is she taking to accomplish that? Wouldn't this make more sense for, like, Aatrox, who's the general of the Ascended Host, for him to do that, as opposed to this random Darkin that we've never heard about until now? I like that we got a new Darkin in the game, but there's just too many questions that Naafiri raises that we don't have answers for yet, that it just sort of sours my mouth, right? I just am not quite happy with where Riot went with Naafiri. Ultimately, though, I think Naafiri is still probably the strongest release of the year, which is pretty disappointing when you think about it. Her kit plays well, it can be used by both neophytes and pros alike, and I do think at the end of the day that her character is interesting enough that you can be intrigued by her in the future. She doesn't feel like Milio, where you know you're not going to see anything more of Milio going forward. Like, it really does feel like this is going to be the kind of champion that we will see more of eventually, just the question is when, so we'll see how that goes. Moving on down the list, we next come to Briar, the Restrained Hunger, as the third champion released in this year. Mechanically, Briar takes a very interesting stance of what if you could self-crowd control to gain bonuses. This idea has been done a couple of times before with champions like Xerath and Varus, who rooted themselves or slowed themselves in order to charge up a powerful attack. I think it's the kind of space that is interesting to explore, but I also think that it fundamentally has some play issues, and Briar in particular has some play issues. Mostly this is because Briar is a taunt. And taunts control your character in more than just one way. Slowing yourself, rooting yourself, those sort of do one thing and one thing only, but you still keep the rest of your champion's outputs. As Xerath, you could still cast spells, even if you self-rooted. I'm talking about old Xerath, for those of you who are curious. For Varus, even though you're slowed, you can still flash, use other abilities, right? There are other things that you can do. But taunting not only takes control of your character's movement, but it also takes control of your character's auto-attacks and your character's behavior. And there's a lot of League of Legends that is based around mouse movement, right? Choosing where to move your character to dodge incoming enemy damage, or to maybe move into danger in order to avoid danger. For example, moving into a Darius queue in order to avoid the sweet spot of the queue, right? Like, there are a lot of sort of micro things like that that are very fun to do with the mouse. And Briar ultimately just kind of says, press W and watch the cutscene of me killing people, which isn't particularly interesting, especially not when you've used all your other cooldowns. You press W, and it's sort of like there's nothing I can do at this point to influence her behavior. It's literally just watch Briar run at enemy champions and try to kill them. This is a double whammy because Briar is also an auto-attack focused champion. It's a requirement because of her self-taunt, but it also means there aren't really ways in which she can outplay or be outplayed. If she has more stats than you, she wins. If you have more stats than her, you win, right? Like, there's nothing really that you can do to influence her behavior other than saying, I know she's taunted, she'll have to run right at me, and I can aim skill shots in that area, but then if Briar's stats are better, then it doesn't matter. Even if you land skill shots, she'll just chase you down regardless. And obviously being a drain tank further complicates things by saying, yeah, Briar also heals for a ton. So it's not even that, like, you can maybe sort of trade it out with her. She's going to heal so much that there isn't really anything you can do. So we end up with this sort of stat stick champion whose entire purpose is, oh, what if I CC'd myself, but I got a bunch of stats? But the answer is it doesn't really matter, right? You're going to stat check me one way or the other. I think Riot did an okay job given the core concept of Briar, though. I think her kit has some compensation for her high healing by removing her ability to have health regen at all, and she does have some interesting decisions to make with her button usage, doing things like a full channel on the E versus a quick tap just to break the taunt, Wing into range in order to Q, or maybe Qing first in order to E somebody into a wall while they're stunned, right? Like, there are some things that I think Briar can do that are interesting and do give her actual decisions to be made, but I think that at the end of the day, she's handicapped by her need to just not play the game at all, which is not very fun. She's also not a beginner-friendly champion. I've had to tell multiple summoners, both on my team and not on my team, to use her E to break taunt because they literally don't know that's a mechanic. They do not read the tooltips, they just play the champion by feel, and they run under tower and die repeatedly, and I have to tell them, press your E to break taunt. And then all they do from then on out is full channel the E. They don't know you can just tap it. And there's just a lot about Briar that is not readily intelligible for many players. And as a result, she's not a very friendly beginner champion, despite the fact that I feel Riot really wanted her to be approachable and beginner friendly. Balance-wise as well, Briar has generally proven to follow my assumptions. I predicted when we knew her kit that she was going to be a 40% win rate champion or a 60% win rate champion with no in-between, and generally this has been her balance. After she launched, she had a miserable 30% win rate. Players learned how to play her, and now she has been nerfed in 4 of the last 5 patches that she's been live for. That's kind of crazy when you think about it. I generally feel like she's not too far above the power curve of the game right now, but I'm still not sure she'll be easy to balance as time goes on. I really feel like Riot will eventually hit a tipping point where they'll have to nerf her hard enough to get her to stop being above 50, at which point she'll plunge all the way back down to 40, just because, again, stat stick champion, emphasis on healing, emphasis on being ahead, and if you're not ahead, you contribute nothing at all to your team, and it's just going to be a very tricky champion to balance, and the pros haven't even gotten their hands on her yet, which I feel will complicate things further. And this is all from a mechanical perspective, right? I don't know if there's a lot from the way that Briar was designed that makes her easy to balance. We'll see as time goes on, but my prediction, honestly, is that she will continue to get nerfed until she drops to a 40% win rate, and she'll be in that sort of balance roller coaster forever. Character-wise, Briar's nothing but a disappointment. I think Riot started from a really interesting place on Briar, though. They had this idea of someone who was made to be a brainless assassin, who was then shackled and, like, was forced, sort of, to learn control, but then who understood that having control confers some advantages, right? She's not totally consumed with her bloodlust 100% of the time, so the pillory, even though she can break out of it whenever she wants, she keeps, even though she's free now, because being in control of herself is important, but that there are sometimes where you gotta let go of control, you gotta go ham, and Briar understands this as well, and that's a very interesting dichotomy for this character to have, on top of the fact that she spent so much time in prison or underground not interacting with people, that she doesn't, like, understand the world at all, and as a result there's this very interesting ability for Briar to have a very unique take on everything that's going on in Runeterra as a whole, and even she's connected to a ton of different champions. Obviously she was created by Vladimir at LeBlanc's behest, she was captured and imprisoned by Swain for an extended period of time, there are a ton of champions that she has theoretical interactions with, but Riot threw all of that out the window. They said, we want Jinx 2.0. She is exactly she's almost the same kind of character, you guys, in that they're both like, oh, I'm so quirky, but also I'm violent and will kill you, Lamau XD. Like, those are both those exact characters, right? Jinx is that way, and Briar is that way. And I don't think Briar needed to be that way. I really feel like Riot could have made her a very interesting character. They could have kept some levity. I'm not saying she needed to be super grimdark and edgy, but they could have differentiated her from Jinx, and I feel like they really just said, no, we want Jinx 2.0. And her teaser trailer showcases exactly what I'm saying by that, when that it was very similar stylistically to the Jinx trailer and to Jinx's general iconography. To me, it's obvious that Riot wanted a Jinx 2.0 when they made Briar, and I just don't think that that was correct for the character. Ultimately, I think Briar is a wait-and-see champion that I don't have high hopes for, right? This is like watching a train run out of track, realizing, well, maybe it'll stop fast enough, but you sort of know in your heart of hearts it's not going to. That's me with Briar. I think that there are some things she does quite well. She ultimately, I just don't think is going to shape up as a champion. She's a balance roller coaster. She was handled terribly from a characterization perspective, and because of her ultimately flawed kit design, I don't see any way for Riot to actually fix this. Again, I might be wrong, I'm still waiting and seeing, but I don't have high hopes for this character, suffice to say. Next up, let's go ahead and cover our one and only VGU that came out this year, in this case, Jax. Now, technically, Jax received his gameplay update last year. He only got his visual updates this year. We actually didn't even know when Jax got his update that it was the VGU. Riot phrased it as a mid-scope, and then we found out, oh, he's getting a VGU. Oh, they shipped the mechanical portion of it last year, and then the VGU, the actual visual portion of it, was delayed until this year. But because the visual part of it came out this year, I feel comfortable talking about it this year because I didn't talk about it last year, so we may as well just cover the full package now that it's all in one place. Mechanically, the VGU doesn't really change Jax's playstyle. He's still auto-attacking, counter-striking, and smacking you with targeted damage while being a stat-stick champion. I personally was hoping the VGU would move Jax away from being an auto-attack-focused champ, because I hate how much damage Jax can deal without really offering any counterplay, especially with a targeted gap closer. But since Riot seems to think otherwise, right, like, this would be the one time where they could actually take a look at Jax's kit and say, thou shalt not be a stat-stick, and they chose not to. So I guess at this point, I have to, like, admit defeat. Like, clearly Riot are happy with Jax's design, and at this point I can only shrug and say, okay, you guys like that, I guess, so I will have to learn to live with Jax being this way because he's unlikely to get another VGU for at least the foreseeable future. I do like some of the things that Riot did to Jax, though, with the VGU. I really like the change to his R. I think it makes him feel less stat-sticky than before by having a failure condition, but being much stronger if he can execute on the ability. Having to actually hit it, but then being very strong if you do, I think was a very nice change for Jax. So there are some things that I liked, but mostly it was just small tweaks that don't fundamentally shift where Jax was before, and I think, again, at this point, it's sort of is what it is for me personally. Balance-wise, Jax has been playable at the pro level ever since his balance changes went live. He was formerly a pick ban champion, and I think he even saw some play at the Worlds tournament this year, but meta shifts and balance changes have gotten him to a relatively sweet spot of being pro playable without having an overly high presence. In terms of normal play, I haven't seen him very much in casuals, outside of like the rate I would normally see him at, so as a result, I feel like Riot have gotten him into a sweet spot, and I really, really like that. Where Jax is playable at the professional level, but not, like, overwhelmingly strong at the professional level. From a character perspective as well, Jax hasn't really changed. That's understandable, though, given that his original introduction into League of Legends basically read, he is mysterious, and, like, left it at that. There wasn't anything to go off of back then. But over the years, Riot have done a good job of building out Jax's personality and motivations to turn him from a weirdly skilled soldier of fortune who chooses to fight with a lamppost for no reason into a patriot of Acacia wielding a legendary relic from this lost city to stand against the void. I think they still have yet to confirm the Jax connection. They may have confirmed that someplace, but I don't think they have. And they also haven't confirmed Jax's race. He's not human, but we don't actually know what he is. But I think some mystery is fine for the character. I'm alright with it just being like, yeah, he's here to fight, and he's old, and that's all we really need to know, right? And he uses the Light of Acacia because it's powerful, but also because that's just how he rolls, baby. I'm really hoping Riot never reveal his face, though. Riot never give us unmasked Jax. I would hate that. I think, again, some of the mystery is still fun to have. I also think that Legends of Runeterra did a ton for Jax, and the League of Legends team basically just took and ran with the development that they did for him. Again, we don't really know what the Light of Acacia is, but at least it's not a random lamppost that he found along the way, and I like them building out his sort of coterie of ragtag misfits that are all still experts at fighting, even though they don't actually have real weapons, right? They're fighting with pots, they're fighting with rakes, they're fighting with wrenches, but somehow they're still more deadly than a ton of Runeterra's most deadly fighters. Tangentially related, I love that Jax references in-game his duel with Fiora without letting us know who won. That was such a fun bit when they originally wrote it, and I was looking forward to seeing if they would keep it in, and they did. We still don't know who won, but I love the fact that they did say, yeah, Jax and Fiora have canonically fought, we just don't know who actually won that duel. Ultimately, though I'm disappointed that Riot didn't take the opportunity to inject more counterplay into Jax's kit, I think the rework overall landed very well and did justice for one of League of Legends' most venerable characters, and at this point, I'll just have to admit defeat on the balance. Clearly, Riot like his design. Finally, we come to Hwei the Visionary, our final champion of the year, and who barely made the release schedule this year. He's coming out midway through December, and as a result, I also don't have a lot of time to really review and let his design sink in. We just don't have that much time with the champion before the end of the year, and I do want to get this video out to you guys still in 2023. So, with that said, I'm going to give you guys my best thoughts on Hwei and where I think he can go in the future. Mechanically, he's one of the most complex champions Riot has ever designed, and pushes the boundaries of what champions are allowed to do in-game. This has some disadvantages, and potentially some balance issues, but ultimately it makes for a very unique champion. Having 9 separate basic abilities on top of his ult and passive means Hwei has a ton of options at his disposal, but being limited to only one ability per mood, per cooldown, means he has to make tough choices every time something comes off cooldown. Make the wrong decision, and you may not get as much value, or potentially even die because you didn't realize you had an ability at your disposal. Make the right decision, and Hwei very frequently has the tools to get out of every scenario, or to get into any scenario he wants to. And as a result, I think that the design is flexible enough that you have the ability to, at least good Hwei players have the ability to choose anything that they want to do, and will look very, very powerful while playing him. Despite this, though, Hwei still feels relatively grounded, even though he has 12 abilities. He can't do everything, and he lacks some of the high DPS or burst damage or range of other mages, which makes him good in scenarios where you want general value, but less good if you have specific comps in mind. For example, if you're trying to play poke comp, don't play Hwei because the only thing he can really do is poke with QW, which has its own restrictions on it, so I don't feel like he's really a stand-in in every scenario, but certainly he's a good potential blind pick, as just a generally good champion that does lots of different things, but isn't particularly compelling, sort of like a New Age Orianna. There are some issues with Hwei's exact casting paradigm. You have to remember the various button combinations to get to the ability that you want. Keeping track of what mood you're in can be an issue. If you don't realize you spam casted a QW, you enter the W mood, then you try to cast EW, but your W was still selected, so you cast WE instead, right? Like, there are some problems, I think, with the way in which you need to cast abilities and press buttons on Hwei, but that's because of the restrictions that League of Legends just sort of has. It's not an MMO, unfortunately, and doesn't have a hotbar, and Riot did the best they could to make Hwei's spellbook-like feature work, but he still feels like a League of Legends champion at the end of the day, despite the sort of weirdness, and I think his design is generally fine. So long as Riot plan on keeping him as the only champion with 12 abilities, I'm okay with his mechanical design, and I don't think he necessarily breaks the game in an unhealthy way, as with champions like Zeri or Briar. Balance-wise, Hwei's not been out long enough for us to really get a handle on his balance. He has been hot-fixed on his release day, in fact, and is slated for more buffs on 14.1. I disagree with both of these. I think Riot should really give the community more time to learn Hwei, because as they learn him, his win rate will get better. But generally, I haven't felt like he's an unbalanceable champion, again, as the other champions I've talked about before. I think Hwei has plenty of weaknesses. He is an easy dive target. He's very squishy. He has a weak early game that can be abused, and as a result, I don't feel like Hwei is going to be an unbalanceable champion. We have plenty of other squishy, immobile mid-lane mages that still see play and are not problematic, and Hwei is still in that boat, even if he has 12 abilities. I do feel like a perfectly piloted Hwei may fall into the Aphelios trap, where all of the burden of knowledge on his opponents is on his opponents rather than on the pilot, but I think that Hwei, being a more traditional mage, still gives him enough weaknesses that can be exploited. I think generally, as long as Riot are balancing Hwei around the top tiers of play and not trying to balance him across the entirety of the League of Legends community, we should be in an okay spot with regards to where he's at. Character-wise, Hwei isn't the most interesting champion that came out this year, but I think he still stands above most of the other releases this year due to his unique relationship with Jhin. Having a deep appreciation for art in conjunction with an understanding of the depths of artistic expression gives Hwei an interesting perspective on Jhin's performances. Even though he doesn't like Jhin's body bag count that he gets for each of his performances, he understands why Jhin creates, and that Jhin is creating from the very depth of his soul, which is something that Hwei desperately wants to do, but if he lets himself go like that, he will also start having a body count as he creates art. Jhin wants to try and drag Hwei in that direction. Hwei wants to drag Jhin in the other direction. I think there's a very interesting push and pull dynamic between the two that is just so fascinating to me, and I can't wait to see how they develop and push on each other going forward, assuming, of course, that we actually get written lore, because Riot are not writing lore anymore. He obviously isn't extremely tied to any particular region's story, but I found him compelling as his own character in a way that few other champions did this year, and as a result, I, again, think he's one of the best written characters that we've gotten in 2023. Ultimately, though, we're still figuring out where Hwei stands. I wish Riot had released him first this year, so I'd have an entire year to figure out what I think about him, but I do really like where Hwei is at off the cuff. I think that he has landed well despite being such a complicated champion. He has a very interesting character, and I feel like he has the capability to become one of League of Legends' most beloved or behated champions. Only time will tell where he lands, but I think he's set up for success, at least as far as his release has gone. And that is going to be it for me today, guys. Thank you all so very much for watching. I really appreciate it. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Let me know what you thought of the champions of this year down in the comment section below. If you think I got anybody wrong or anybody right, let me know that all down in the comments. If you enjoyed the video today, go ahead and leave it a like. And if you really enjoyed the video, consider subscribing, especially if you made it all the way to the end. I upload a video every Monday, Friday, and on patch days as well. Once again, thank you guys so very much for watching. I do appreciate it. And I'll talk to you all later.